I mean, I hope my channel doesn't just come to be all about analyzing and dismantling patriarchy. But on the other hand, is that what is needed to basically bridge the divide between the sexes? In my last video, I explained how the church managed to divide men and women who were otherwise acting in solidarity during the 14 and 1500s when capitalism was overtaking feudalism and the commons was being privatized, the common land from which men and women both extracted resources and livelihood. And so this channel probably will be about dismantling patriarchy, the toxic form of it, promoting the healthy form of it, as I explained in my last video, and looking at capitalism as a bedmaiden to patriarchy or vice versa. And I don't know if, these belief systems that I have about capitalism and patriarchy are conducive to bridging the divide. On the other hand, I don't know how the divide could be bridged without looking at that, given that, as far as I can tell, as far as I can understand, the extractive hierarchical system, which is based in power abuse and accumulation of wealth by way of abusing power dynamics, that is at the core of these imbalances that are created through dependency. Now, the irony and strange part of it is that we as human beings are dependent on nature. Women become dependent on men when they have a child. And I think that to some degree, even women who don't have children, even women who use birth control and prevent conception, and even in this day and age where women have choice whether they have children, supposedly, even in the midst of that, and even in spite of that, the reality is that sex is a more vulnerable position for women. Birth control can fail, or birth control, to the extent that it works, if we're talking about mainstream methods of birth control like the hormonal birth control pill or the IUD, those forms of birth control are not liberating to women to the extent that they deplete nutrients that women need for their bodies to function, and they create a whole host of symptoms that are not normally attributed to birth control but which crop up later on. So if women are trading their health and well-being for so-called sexual liberation, and then that means that the sort of, I don't want to call it fake feminism, but the form of feminism that is telling us that we have liberation because we no longer have to be dependent on men to the extent that we no longer have to have children with them, is still all done at the expense of our bodies. So there's really no getting around the fact that sex happens in a woman's body, that whether she conceives or not, to the extent she's using birth control, she is paying the price on behalf of the couple, and to the extent that if she has a child, she is becoming vulnerable and financially dependent. And since most women become mothers, even though these days we have more of a choice as to when we become a mother, to the extent that most women become mothers, this analysis of the power differential and the dependency that having children causes is still very much relevant. Even if we're not back in the times when we had no access to birth control, which I think in our society we tend to think that was the status quo for the majority of humankind, that like birth control is some kind of modern invention, which it is not. The Caliban and the Witch, that book that I referenced in the last video, demonstrates clearly that all throughout the ages women have had knowledge about birth control, how to regulate their fertility, also how to have abortions, and that has become part of women's, or had at that point become part of women's knowledge base that was passed down through women, and which was deliberately eradicated during the witch burning. So it's not surprising, I guess you could say, that if the marketplace in capitalism needs a labor force, then the politics around whether women have access to birth control or not is very salient. It's very relevant, right? If you can control women's access to their own control of their own bodies, then you can create a greater dependency, right? So like right now, the birth control pill market is in the multi-billions of dollars a year, and what is it, around 250 million women are on hormonal birth control. And I don't really want to go into ranting about like how bad this is for women's not only physical health, but by extension emotional and psychological health. It literally affects how our brain functions. These are synthetic hormones that women are being given, and even if you're using the copper IUD, the mineral effects are very similar between the copper IUD and hormonal birth control in terms of how they both deplete zinc, which women need not only for testosterone, which is a hormone of assertion, but they also need it for connective tissue integrity, removing heavy metals, and all kinds of a host of many other very important functions, because every mineral is needed for hundreds of enzyme functions in the body. So where am I going with all of this? Where I'm going with all of this is that obviously my perspective is that to heal the gender divide, we need a culture that absolutely honors and cherishes women. And of course we can't do that if women don't honor and cherish themselves. So we as women have the greatest leverage point in dismantling patriarchy by way of, valuing ourselves and becoming conscious of these deeply embedded programs, which I mentioned in the last video. They're not just programs of control. They're programs of control rooted in trauma. So there was a genocide against women during the witch trials, and this creates a trauma response in which women will control themselves or alter their behavior to be more accommodating in a system that could literally and did literally punish women for being out of line. In other words, for having knowledge about their bodies, having reproductive control over their bodies, that was punishable by death. So I don't think that we can dismiss the severity of how that can impact women in a society in the sense of a survival instinct to comply, right? Daughters were literally brought to the burnings of their mothers as a means to ensure that the daughters understood what not to do, right? And so one example of how thorough this programming is and how difficult I think it is to dismantle it is something that I've noticed recently in my interactions with men, where it's a very subtle but very pernicious realization that I feel that I owe men something, even if they don't even do anything for me. It's weird. But so let's say I go on a date with a guy, or a guy asks me out, and I'm getting much better at dismantling this, but a man asked me out who's a nice enough guy. I like him as a person, open to being a community member with him. And I could have just told him, okay, yeah, I'm happy to go on this date with you, but I just want you to know that I'm not interested in you romantically. And I could have gone and, still taken up on his date. But what I noticed is that I felt guilty for saying no to him. And I felt obliged just by way of his, kindness in offering to cook me lunch, that I felt a need to apologize for my boundary. And I really think that although this is subtle, I didn't give into that programming. Now there's this awkwardness in being around him, but then I'm just so glad that I did that early on, instead of feeling obliged and just, arguing myself into doing it by saying, oh, well, he's just being a nice guy, just go ahead and take him up on his offer, and then later feeling obliged to or conflicted about whether I should continue to say yes to him. I'm very glad that I just simply said no outright. And it's not that I don't like this person. I just could tell that he had romantic intent and I wasn't interested in that. But this feeling that we owe men something is incredible, because it's like, it's just amazing where does that come from, I guess is my question. And how could we have healthy relationships between men and women if women feel indebted to men? And where does this come from? I believe it comes from the fact that women used to be owned. We used to be part of property, right? So if you're owned, you need permission from another man to go against what other men want, right? And it's not that any of us consciously believe that, but I think that I do think that there are definitely residual elements left over from these periods of time when women were literally owned, which was not that long ago. So up until 1996, a woman could be raped legally by her husband if she was married to him, right? So I think that's just something that we need to keep in mind when we're trying to find solutions to the discord between the sexes, is how long-standing these legal frameworks are and how recent some of them are that have very much normalized concepts of ownership over women's bodies. If you don't own your body, I don't know how you can have an egalitarian relationship. And so this whole question of what is an egalitarian relationship, because I do think that there are many brands of feminism, and I do think also that capitalism and the powers that be have appropriated feminism and kind of twisted and distorted it and made it more extreme. If you go onto social media, there's a whole backlash right now of people who are basically saying that feminism was invented by the Rockefellers and that it's a psyop. And that's the psyop. The psyop that feminism is a psyop, which doesn't mean, of course, that feminism couldn't be appropriated or that it doesn't have a toxic side, just like patriarchy has a toxic side. Feminism has a healthy side and a toxic side. And that's a natural thing for a toxic form of feminism to arise in the midst of toxic patriarchy, right? It's like an energetic match. But it's not... Like, I do understand and agree with the idea that, like, the more resentful women get about these power imbalances, the more that degrades the ability to have actual union, and that it is misconstrued when we say that what feminism is that men and women are the same. Now, saying men and women are of equal value is a very different thing than saying that they are the same. And so in the next video, I'll talk more about equality and egalitarianism and reciprocal, and how that relates to consistent reciprocity. Now, if one person is worth less than another, then no reciprocity is needed, right? Or if in the case of if you're a slave or property, then no reciprocity is needed, right? And so we're not living in those times anymore, but I still think that there are, these built-in forms of entitlement that men have that lead them to be perpetrators of these power imbalances, even unconsciously, because it's built in, right? And in the same way that becoming a victim can be kind of built into this system, to the extent that it's easy to take on the victim stance as women because we're already in that position, right? And so having men and women, bridging the gender divide, involves not only women overcoming victim consciousness or men overcoming the victim consciousness of all these angry feminist women, right? But also men overcoming victor consciousness, always needing to dominate. And this is what patriarchy teaches men, is that you can be, this is what Terence Real says, the lie of patriarchy is that you can be connected or protected, but not both at the same time. So in other words, if you're protected and powerful, you can't be connected. And if you're connected, you can't be powerful and protected. So that's a lie I'll go into in the next video, but I appreciate people like Terence Real who have given me frameworks and language to understand what's going on here. And in this hierarchy, in the toxic hierarchy I'm referring to, which is different than the healthy hierarchy that I'm really interested in, it's all based in one up and one down behavior, which Terence Real says is basically a compensation for low self-esteem. And he has a very specific definition of what self-esteem is, which is self-esteem is the ability to have warm regard for yourself in the midst of your imperfections. Whereas patriarchy basically creates a system where self-esteem is based off of competence or performance, right? And that's not actually self-esteem. It's easy to feel good about yourself if you've performed well, but the real test of self-esteem is how much do you love yourself in the midst of your imperfections? Same thing with relational self-esteem, which Terence Real describes as the ability to have warm regard for your relationship in the midst of its imperfections. So I'll talk about that in the next video.